In the autumn of 1944, the war entered a new and unsettling phase. Allied cities began to suffer explosions. Without warning, no sirens, no aircraft, no time to seek shelter. Streets vanished in an instant. Homes collapsed as if struck by fate rather than machinery. The weapon responsible was the V-2 rocket, a creation unlike anything the world had seen before. It descended faster than sound itself, turning the sky into an accomplice. For civilians in London, Antwerp, and The Hague, fear no longer approached. It simply arrived. Within the German command, the V-2 inspired a dangerous belief. Here was a weapon that could not be intercepted, could not be outrun, and could not be answered. It crossed borders with mathematical certainty, carrying a 1-ton warhead from launch site to city center in minutes. Engineers spoke of altitude and velocity with reverence. Planners spoke of revenge. The rocket was framed not merely as a weapon, but as proof that German science still reigned supreme and that the war could yet be bent back into their favor. Yet beneath the terror it created, the V-2 concealed a quiet failure. Each rocket required immense resources, rare metals, precision factories, and thousands of laborers working under brutal conditions. Entire supply chains were sacrificed to produce a weapon that struck blindly. The rockets fell where gravity chose, not where strategy demanded. Factories continued to run. Ports remained open. Armies kept moving. The Allied war machine absorbed the blows and advanced regardless. Still, Germany persisted. As cities burned and fronts collapsed, resources flowed into the rocket program with near religious conviction. The V-2 was no longer evaluated by results, but by hope. It promised shock where victory was no longer possible. By the time the first rockets fell, the war's outcome was already decided elsewhere, on beaches, in skies, and across shattered borders. In the end, the V-2 revealed a hard truth. It was a weapon of fear, not decision. It changed how war felt, not how it ended. What began as a technological triumph became a lesson in misplaced faith, an investment in terror when time itself had already run out. And even as the last rockets fell, their legacy was only beginning because the men who built them were already being sought by new powers, eager to turn yesterday's failure into tomorrow's future. Germany's search for a decisive weapon did not begin with desperation, but with belief. Long before the war turned against them, German planners imagined a future in which distance itself could be conquered. Cities would no longer be protected by borders or coastlines. A weapon launched from deep within the Reich could strike the heart of an enemy capital with mechanical certainty. This was not conceived as terror alone, but as strategy, a technological solution to a geopolitical problem that armies could no longer solve. Out of this belief emerged a weapon unlike any before it. At the testing grounds of Peenemünde, engineers pushed past the limits of aviation and artillery. The result was the V-2 rocket, a ballistic missile capable of climbing into the upper atmosphere before falling back to Earth at supersonic speed. It carried a 1-ton warhead across hundreds of kilometers in minutes. No fighter could intercept it. No anti-aircraft gun could reach it. When it struck, it did so without warning. War had entered a vertical dimension. Yet even at its birth, the V-2 carried an unspoken irony. Technologically, it was years ahead of its time. Strategically, it existed in a moment already slipping away. While scientists refined guidance systems and fuel mixtures, Germany was losing pilots, tanks, and territory. The rocket promised reach, but it could not hold ground. It represented mastery of physics, not control of the battlefield. The war it was meant to change was already being decided elsewhere. As Allied forces advanced from west and east, the V-2 took on new meaning. It became one of the last remaining hopes for reversal. Production continued under increasing pressure, often underground, shielded from bombers but starved of time. Each successful launch was celebrated as proof that innovation could compensate for loss. Yet the numbers told a different story. Rockets were few, accuracy was limited, and the cost of each launch far exceeded the damage it caused. In the end, the V-2 revealed its true nature. It was a marvel of engineering, a glimpse into the future of warfare, but not a weapon of decision. It demonstrated what science could achieve, not what strategy required. The rocket could reach the enemy's cities, but it could not reach victory. And as Germany's final months closed in, others were already watching, closely studying the blueprints, the failures, and the men behind them preparing to claim the future the V-2 had briefly exposed. When the V-2 missile entered combat in late 1944, its effect was immediate and unnerving. Londoners heard no approaching aircraft, no rising whine of engines. The explosion came first. Buildings collapsed inward. Streets were torn open. Entire neighborhoods were reduced in seconds. Traveling faster than sound, the missile offered no warning and no defense. For the first time in modern warfare, a city could be struck without the chance to react. Terror was delivered at the speed of gravity. German leadership placed great faith in this effect. The V-2 was not designed primarily to destroy factories or halt armies. It was intended to break will. The belief was simple and seductive. If civilian morale could be shattered, political pressure would follow. Cities under constant, unpredictable attack would demand peace. Negotiation, not invasion, would end the war. The rocket was imagined as a psychological lever, capable of succeeding where conventional bombing had failed. Yet the reality behind the fear told a different story. Each V-2 missile consumed enormous resources, specialized fuel, precision components, and labor diverted from an already strained economy. Production required underground factories and tens of thousands of workers. Accuracy was limited, and targets were often random. While the explosions were devastating at street level, they rarely struck military objectives. Ports functioned, rail lines were repaired, industry adapted. The cost of terror far exceeded its strategic return. The Allies were shaken, but not undone. Civil defense systems adjusted. Emergency services learned to respond without warning. Governments controlled information carefully, denying Germany the psychological victory it sought. More importantly, the Allied advance did not slow. Armies crossed rivers. Bombers filled the skies. The war continued according to its own momentum, largely indifferent to the rockets falling behind the front lines. In the end, the V-2 achieved exactly what it was designed to do and no more. It terrified civilians, disrupted daily life, and announced a new age of warfare. But it did not force negotiation. It did not alter strategy. It did not stop defeat. Terror, it turned out, was not the same as control. And as the missiles continued to fall, a quieter realization began to spread. This weapon's true significance might not lie in the war it failed to change, but in the future it was about to shape. By late 1944, belief within parts of Germany's leadership had hardened into certainty. The V-2 rocket was no longer seen as one option among many, but as the ultimate solution. Its speed, range, and novelty inspired the hope that a limited number of decisive strikes could succeed where conventional efforts had failed. This belief shaped decisions at the highest levels. As pressure mounted on all fronts, resources were redirected toward the rocket program. Production was accelerated despite shortages, and engineers were pushed to deliver results under immense strain. The V-2 was presented as a tool capable of shifting momentum through technology alone. Yet the true impact of the rocket fell short of expectations. Each launch demonstrated impressive technical achievement, but practical results remained limited. The system could not control territory, secure supply lines, or alter the broader balance of the conflict. Its influence remained isolated from the realities of coordinated modern warfare. As development continued, the cost became increasingly clear. Materials, skilled labor, transport, and fuel were consumed at a moment when efficiency mattered most. Assets that might have supported broader defensive needs were instead concentrated on a single, uncertain solution. In the end, the V-2 became what it was never meant to be: a symbol, not of dominance, but of urgency. It reflected a final effort to change outcomes through innovation alone, arriving too late to reshape events already set in motion. And as defeat drew closer, attention shifted away from where the rockets fell, toward the knowledge behind them and who would carry it forward. The V-2 missile succeeded in one regard with chilling consistency. It frightened those it struck. Its arrival was sudden, its violence absolute. But beneath this surface of terror lay persistent technical strain. Engines failed. Guidance systems drifted. Launch crews worked under constant pressure, racing against fuel instability and mechanical limits. Each missile that reached a city represented not efficiency, but survival through error. And each launch carried a cost so high that even its creators struggled to justify it. Still, belief endured at the top. German leaders clung to the idea that fear itself could become a strategic weapon. If Allied cities could be kept in a state of constant anxiety, Resources would be diverted inward. Fighters would be pulled from the front. Bombers would be reassigned to hunt launch sites. Civilian unrest would spread upward into political pressure. The V-2 was not meant to win battles, it was meant to unbalance societies. Terror, they believed, would do what force could no longer accomplish. The irony was relentless. The very weapon designed to conserve German strength instead consumed it. Each missile required specialized fuel, precision manufacturing, and guarded transport routes. Underground factories demanded power, labor, and secrecy, even as Allied bombing steadily collapsed the infrastructure supporting them. What the V-2 destroyed in enemy cities was measured in buildings and lives. What it drained from Germany was measured in time, material, and strategic flexibility. As rockets fell on London and Antwerp, Allied bombers continued their work uninterrupted. Rail yards burned. Oil facilities were reduced to wreckage. Air superiority tightened. On the ground, armies advanced despite the noise behind them. The V-2 forced no retreat, delayed no offensive, and altered no timetable. It screamed its presence, but the war moved forward as if it were not there. The struggle became one of imbalance. Germany invested ever more in a weapon that produced spectacle without leverage. The Allies, though shaken, absorbed the blows and adapted. Emergency response systems improved. Information was controlled. Civilian morale, tested but unbroken, held firm. The fear was real, but it was contained. And without political collapse or military disruption, terror alone proved insufficient. The revelation arrived too late to matter. The V-2 was not a path to victory, but a demonstration of a dangerous truth. Fear can wound, but it cannot decide. It can haunt cities, but it cannot hold territory or reverse momentum. The rocket's legacy lay not in what it achieved during the war, but in what it suggested about wars yet to come. And as the final missiles were prepared, attention quietly shifted away from their targets toward the engineers, the designs, and the knowledge that would soon outlive the Reich itself. The V-2 rocket was conceived as a weapon aimed not at armies, but at minds. German planners believed that fear, applied relentlessly and without warning, would fracture civilian morale. Cities struck from the sky with no defense would lose confidence in their leaders. Panic would spread faster than any missile. The Allied public, it was assumed, would eventually demand relief, if not through victory, then through negotiation. Terror was expected to succeed where force had not. The initial shock seemed to confirm this belief. Explosions arrived without sound or signal, tearing through streets and homes in an instant. Civilians struggled to understand what had hit them. Newspapers searched for language that could describe a weapon no one could see coming. For a brief moment, uncertainty ruled. The fear was genuine, and it cut deep. Yet fear alone does not move in only one direction. Instead of collapse, something harder began to form. Allied governments responded quickly, not with panic, but with control. Information was managed. Emergency services adapted. Public messaging emphasized endurance rather than vulnerability. The absence of warning, once terrifying, became a grim fact of life, accepted, absorbed, and resisted. What the V-2 introduced in shock, the population countered with resolve. The irony soon became clear. Far from slowing the Allied war effort, the rocket attacks intensified it. Each strike reinforced the necessity of ending the war completely. The V-2 did not inspire hesitation, it sharpened purpose. Production schedules accelerated. Military planning pressed forward with renewed urgency. The logic was simple and unyielding. As long as Germany retained the capacity to launch these weapons, the war could not end halfway. The struggle shifted from fear to response. Scientists and intelligence officers analyzed wreckage, trajectories, and launch patterns. Efforts were made to locate production sites and disrupt supply chains. Bombing campaigns were adjusted, while no effective defense against the missile itself could be devised. The Allies focused on removing its source. The answer to terror was not surrender, but pressure applied relentlessly and without pause. Civilians endured, often quietly. Loss was real, and grief widespread. But daily life continued. Trains ran, factories worked, streets were repaired. The absence of visible enemies in the sky denied Germany the spectacle it sought. There were no dogfights, no alarms, only resilience filling the silence between impacts. The psychological battlefield, once assumed to be Germany's advantage, slipped steadily out of reach. The revelation was unavoidable. Psychological warfare, when unaccompanied by strategic leverage, could not decide the outcome of a global conflict. The V-2 struck cities, but it did not slow armies or weaken alliances. The Allied advance continued, shaped not by fear, but by momentum. And as the front lines closed in on Germany, attention began to drift beyond the explosions toward the origins of the weapon itself, and the men who had built it, now standing at the edge of a very different reckoning. By the time the V-2 entered sustained use, Germany's war effort was already unraveling. Fronts that once felt distant were now collapsing inward. Cities burned under relentless bombing, supply lines fractured, and fuel shortages strangled mobility. In this atmosphere of narrowing options, the rocket assumed a new role, not as a calculated instrument of strategy, but as a final gamble. It was launched not from confidence, but from necessity, pressed into service as the margins of defeat closed in. This timing defined the weapon's deepest irony. The V-2 represented a leap forward in military technology, yet it arrived at a moment when Germany no longer possessed the conditions required to exploit it. Air superiority was lost. Industrial capacity was shrinking. Trained personnel were scarce. Even a revolutionary weapon could not compensate for these absences. The rocket pointed toward the future of warfare, but it was shackled to a present already slipping beyond recovery. As Allied forces advanced from multiple directions, the limits of the V-2 became unmistakable. Armies crossed borders and rivers unimpeded. Logistics hubs were seized. Command structures fractured under pressure. Rockets continued to fall on cities far behind the lines, but they did nothing to slow armored columns or disrupt coordinated offensives. The war was being decided by movement, supply, and air power domains. The V-2 could not touch. Germany's leadership, however, remained under immense internal pressure. The rocket program had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of resistance against inevitability. To abandon it would have meant acknowledging reality. Instead, production was pushed forward despite dwindling returns. Each launch offered momentary reassurance, a brief illusion of agency. Yet the cost was relentless. Resources that might have delayed defeat elsewhere were consumed in service of spectacle. The pressure was not only military, but moral. The V-2 relied on forced labor under brutal conditions, hidden in underground facilities carved from mountains. Thousands died building a weapon that could not save the state it served. This human cost underscored the tragedy of its deployment. Extraordinary intellect and suffering were invested in a project that arrived after its moment had passed. Innovation was not lacking. Timing was. As defeat became unavoidable, the true nature of the lost opportunity emerged. Had such technology existed earlier paired with resources, coordination, and strategic clarity, the war might have unfolded differently. But history does not reward potential. It measures outcomes. The V-2 demonstrated what was possible, not what was effective. It revealed the future while failing the present. The revelation was stark. The rocket was never truly a path to victory. It was a response to defeat already underway, a tool of defiance rather than decision. Germany did not lose the war because the V-2 failed. The V-2 failed because the war was already lost. Its deployment marked not a turning point, but a closing chapter, written in steel and fire. And as the Reich collapsed, the weapon's meaning quietly shifted once more away from the ruins it left behind, and toward the powers now racing to claim its secrets, determined that the next war would not make the same mistake of timing. The shock was not merely that Germany developed the V-2 rocket, but how much it chose to sacrifice for it. At a moment when the Reich faced overwhelming pressure on every front, vast resources were funneled into a single program. Steel, fuel, transport capacity, and skilled labor were redirected away from aircraft production, air defense, and ground forces. Entire factories were committed to a weapon that could not defend German cities, protect supply lines, or hold territory. The decision reflected not strength, but narrowing vision. This investment was driven by belief, an increasingly isolated belief, that one decisive innovation could reverse an otherwise deteriorating situation. The V-2 was seen as a force multiplier, capable of compensating for shortages everywhere else. Its technological sophistication fostered the idea that quality could replace quantity and surprise could overcome momentum. The rocket was imagined as a shortcut through the hard realities of attritional warfare. If Germany could not match the Allies ship for ship, plane for plane, then perhaps it could bypass them altogether. Yet, the irony was unforgiving. While the V-2 stood at the cutting edge of engineering, the war itself demanded balance, coordination, and sustainability. The rocket existed outside this system. It consumed resources without strengthening the fronts where decisions were being made. Tanks required fuel. Fighters required pilots. Cities required air defenses. The V-2 supplied none of these. It represented technical superiority isolated from strategic necessity. As the war dragged on, the struggle intensified. Each additional rocket became more expensive to produce than the last. Bombing raids disrupted transport networks. Fuel shortages complicated launches. Skilled workers were increasingly difficult to replace. Underground facilities demanded power and secrecy even as infrastructure collapsed above them. The cost of each missile rose sharply, while its impact remained fixed. The return on investment was not just minimal, it was negative. Despite this, commitment deepened. Admitting failure would have meant confronting the broader flaws in German strategy: overextension, underestimation of industrial warfare, and reliance on dramatic solutions instead of systemic strength. The V-2 offered distraction. It allowed leadership to point to progress even as the situation worsened. Each launch served as proof that something, at least, was still being built. Meanwhile, the Allies applied pressure where it mattered most. Air superiority tightened its grip. Oil production was systematically dismantled. Supply lines were severed. Armies advanced methodically, supported by overwhelming logistics. The war was being won not through singular breakthroughs, but through coordination and endurance. Against this reality, the V-2 appeared increasingly irrelevant, loud, impressive, and strategically detached. The revelation, when it came, was unavoidable. Germany's focus on the V-2 had not failed because the weapon was ineffective in isolation. It failed because it was never integrated into a viable path to victory. The rocket addressed symptoms: fear, shock, morale, while ignoring causes: material imbalance, lost air control, and strategic overreach. Innovation had replaced introspection. In the end, the V-2 program became a mirror. It reflected a regime searching for answers in technology while avoiding the deeper questions of strategy and sustainability. The weapon did not lose the war, but it revealed how the war was being lost through misallocation, fixation, and the refusal to adapt. And as Germany's resources dwindled to nothing, others were already preparing to adapt very differently, determined to absorb the lessons of this failure and apply them in a world about to be reshaped by rockets, not as gambles, but as foundations. By the final months of the war, the limitations of the V-2 were no longer theoretical. Rockets continued to fall. Explosions continued to scar cities. But the Allied advance pressed forward with steady force. Armored divisions moved west and east without interruption. Supply convoys crossed rivers and borders. Airfields expanded. The war's direction remained unchanged. The V-2 could terrify, but it could not interfere with the machinery that was dismantling Germany piece by piece. This struggle revealed a fundamental mismatch between effect and purpose. Strategic weapons are meant to shape decisions to force an enemy to pause, redirect, or reconsider. The V-2 achieved none of these. It struck behind the lines, disconnected from the front where outcomes were determined. Allied commanders did not alter campaigns because of rocket attacks. Temetables held. Objectives advanced. The war absorbed the shock and continued on its course. The irony was sharp. A weapon conceived as a war changer became little more than a complication. It demanded attention but not adjustment. Civil defense responded. Intelligence analyzed debris. Bombing priorities shifted slightly to suppress launch sites. Yet these responses never rose to the level Germany had hoped for. The V-2 imposed inconvenience, not paralysis. It forced reaction, but not concession. Meanwhile, the costs continued to accumulate. Each launch represented fuel not used by aircraft, labor not repairing rail lines, steel not reinforcing defenses. These were not abstract trade-offs. Germany's ability to fight a conventional war was eroding rapidly, and the V-2 accelerated that erosion. Resources flowed upward into a program that existed outside the strategic framework of survival. What was meant to restore initiative instead drained it. Allied planners understood this imbalance clearly. The rocket was treated as a problem to be managed, not a threat to be feared. Its psychological intent was recognized and neutralized through discipline, messaging, and momentum. The absence of a visible attacker denied Germany a propaganda victory. There were no enemy pilots to shoot down, no battles to dramatize. Just sudden destruction, followed by rebuilding and continuation. As weeks passed, the V-2's failure to alter strategy became undeniable. No offensives were delayed. No negotiations were opened. No alliances wavered. The weapon existed in isolation, loud but strategically hollow. It belonged to a different kind of war than the one being fought, a future war, perhaps, but not this one. The revelation cut deeper than tactical failure. The V-2 did not merely fail to change the war. It actively hastened its end. By diverting resources from air defense, fuel production, and frontline support, it weakened Germany's ability to resist, where resistance still mattered. The rocket became an accelerant not of victory, but of collapse. Its launches coincided with shrinking territory, dwindling supplies, and mounting surrender. What had once been imagined as leverage became liability. Germany's leaders had sought a decisive stroke that could bypass the realities of industrial warfare. Instead, they invested in a weapon that magnified those realities. Attrition, logistics, and coordination, these remained decisive. The V-2 addressed none of them. By the time the last rockets were fired, the outcome was already sealed. The weapon had demonstrated extraordinary technical achievement, but no strategic consequence. It changed the sound of war, not its direction. The trajectory remained fixed toward defeat. And as the smoke settled, the world began to ask a quieter question. If this weapon failed to change the war, why were so many nations now racing to claim it, convinced that next time, timing would make all the difference? The arrival of the V-2 did not produce paralysis for long. Initial shock gave way to urgency, and urgency to method. Allied commanders understood quickly that no conventional defense could stop a missile traveling faster than sound. There would be no interception, no warning, no shield in the sky. But war had never depended solely on defense. If the weapon could not be stopped in flight, then it would have to be confronted at its source, through intelligence, pressure, and adaptation. German planners believed their missile would continue to strike unimpeded. In this belief, there was a measure of truth. The V-2 could not be intercepted once launched, and this fact emboldened those who deployed it. Each successful impact reinforced the idea that the rocket had finally escaped the limits imposed on aircraft and artillery, yet this confidence underestimated the enemy it faced. The Allies did not seek to match the weapon directly. They sought to surround it. Analysis began almost immediately. Wreckage was collected and studied. Trajectories were reconstructed. Intelligence networks traced supply lines, production sites, and launch patterns. What emerged was not a solution, but a map, one that revealed where the V-2 lived before it flew. The rocket's technical edge was undeniable, but it relied on infrastructure that was vulnerable from the air and from the ground. The irony was that a weapon designed to transcend traditional warfare was pulled back into it. Improved radar tracking, aerial reconnaissance, and signal intelligence allowed the Allies to identify launch zones with increasing accuracy. Bombing priorities were adjusted. Rail lines feeding the program were targeted. Fuel depots were destroyed. Factories, many hidden underground, were attacked repeatedly, disrupting output even when they could not be fully destroyed. This marked a turning point. The V-2 did not disappear, but its effectiveness began to erode. Launch rates fluctuated. Accuracy suffered. Crews worked under constant threat, relocating frequently, operating with diminishing support. The missile remained frightening, but its presence grew irregular. The illusion of inevitability faded. The weapon that was supposed to impose rhythm on the war found itself reacting instead. At the same time, Allied civil defense and public resilience improved. Emergency response systems adapted to the absence of warning. Information was tightly controlled, denying Germany the psychological amplification it sought. There were no public panic cycles, no political fractures. The terror remained localized, personal, and tragic, but it did not scale upward into strategic consequence. The psychological battlefield slipped steadily away. Behind the front lines, the broader war effort accelerated. The V-2 did not slow the crossing of rivers, the capture of cities, or the collapse of German air power. In fact, the urgency it created only reinforced Allied resolve. The missile became proof that the war could not be allowed to linger. As long as Germany retained the capacity to launch such weapons, total defeat was the only acceptable outcome. The revelation was unavoidable. The V-2 campaign had failed not because it lacked terror, but because terror alone could not compete with momentum. The Allies had adapted faster than Germany could innovate. The missile's technical brilliance was answered not with imitation, but with integration, intelligence, logistics, air power, and discipline working in concert. The future of warfare had arrived, but it had been absorbed by systems already strong enough to survive it. By the war's final months, Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. The V-2 continued to fall, but its meaning had changed. It no longer represented hope or leverage. It was a final echo of ambition, striking cities as the front lines closed in. And even as Allied forces prepared to end the war in Europe, another contest was quietly beginning, one not over cities or borders, but over the knowledge behind the rocket, and who would carry its lessons into the uncertain world that followed. In the war's final months, the V-2 continued to rise from its launch sites. Even as the ground beneath Germany's feet gave way, Allied armies crossed borders, seized cities, and closed in from every direction. Fuel was scarce. Communications were fractured. Command structures strained under the weight of inevitability. Yet the rockets still flew. They did so not because they could change the outcome, but because stopping them would have meant admitting that nothing remained to be done. This was the struggle at the heart of the V-2's final use. Each launch required effort Germany could scarcely afford. Crews operated under constant threat, relocating again and again as Allied forces advanced. Supply lines shortened, then disappeared. The war was no longer about maneuver or initiative. It was about delay. The V-2 was no longer a weapon of ambition. It was a gesture of defiance, fired into a future that Germany would not inhabit. The irony deepened with every strike. Civilian neighborhoods continued to suffer sudden destruction. Lives were lost without warning, long after the strategic questions of the war had been settled. The weapon still terrorized, still demonstrated its terrible novelty, but terror no longer served a purpose. Britain would not break. The Allies would not pause. The rockets fell into a world already moving past them. As Allied troops pushed deeper into Germany, the V-2's strategic value collapsed entirely. Launch sites were overrun. Production facilities were captured or abandoned. The distance between front lines and targets shrank until the logic of long-range bombardment dissolved. Rockets designed to strike far behind enemy lines now existed in a landscape where the enemy was everywhere. The future had arrived too late, overtaken by events it could not influence. This advance marked a clear turning point. The V-2 could no longer even pretend to shape the war. It was reduced to isolated acts of destruction, disconnected from strategy and devoid of leverage. The weapon that had once promised reach and surprise was now hemmed in by the realities of occupation and collapse. The battlefield had caught up to it. Inside Germany, the symbolism became unavoidable. The V-2 had been presented as proof that ingenuity could overcome circumstance. In its final days, it proved the opposite. No amount of technical brilliance could substitute for lost air superiority, broken logistics, or exhausted manpower. The rocket's continued use revealed not strength, but refusal. The refusal to accept that the war had already moved beyond the reach of any single invention. The revelation lay in what the V-2 ultimately represented. It was not merely a failed weapon, but a record of misplaced faith. It showed how innovation, when severed from strategy and timing, could accelerate collapse rather than prevent it. Resources consumed by the program were resources not spent defending cities, supplying armies, or shortening the war's end. The weapon meant to secure victory had instead helped drain what little remained. When the final rockets were launched, they did not mark a last stand or a decisive moment. They marked exhaustion. Germany's defeat was no longer approaching, it was present. The V-2, once framed as a path forward, had become an echo of what might have been, echoing across cities already preparing for peace. And as the war in Europe drew to a close, the rockets fell silent, not because they had succeeded, but because there was no longer a state left to fire them. What remained was their legacy, waiting to be claimed by a new world, eager to inherit the future Germany had glimpsed, but failed to control. The shock of the V-2 did not end with the war. Long after the last rocket fell, its significance continued to unfold in unexpected ways. As Germany collapsed, Allied forces moved swiftly to secure what remained of the program, its factories, its documents, and most importantly, its engineers. The weapon that had failed to save the Reich now commanded intense interest from those who had defeated it. Though it had not altered the outcome of the war, it had revealed something far more enduring, a new threshold of possibility. This was the V-2's central irony. Conceived as an instrument of destruction, it became a foundation for creation. The same equations that guided a warhead to London could guide a payload beyond the atmosphere. The same engines that carried explosives could carry instruments, satellites, and eventually human beings. What had been built to terrify cities now pointed upward, toward space. A weapon of despair had quietly opened the door to a future defined by exploration. The turning point came not on a battlefield, but in laboratories and briefing rooms across the victorious nations. Allied scientists studied captured rockets piece by piece, tracing their guidance systems, propulsion methods, and structural designs. The V-2 was imperfect, but it was revolutionary. It demonstrated that controlled flight beyond the limits of aircraft was possible. It proved that the boundary between Earth and space was not theoretical, it was reachable. In the United States and the Soviet Union, competition replaced conflict. Engineers once employed by Germany were absorbed into new programs, their knowledge repurposed under different flags. The technology that had failed to win a war now fueled a race to master the skies above the planet. Ballistic missiles evolved rapidly. Space launch vehicles followed. The V-2 became the ancestor of an entirely new class of machines tools that would define the second half of the 20th century. Yet this legacy was not without moral weight. The foundations of post-war rocketry were built on suffering forced labor, brutal conditions, and lives spent constructing a weapon that offered no salvation. The achievements that followed carried this shadow with them. Each successful launch into space echoed with the knowledge of where the technology began and at what cost. Progress did not erase origin. It carried it forward. The revelation, with time, became clear. The V-2 mattered not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed about humanity's capacity to reshape the world. It marked the moment when war pushed technology beyond the atmosphere, unintentionally accelerating the arrival of the space age. Its true impact was felt not in 1944, but in the decades that followed, as rockets carried satellites into orbit and footprints onto the moon. History rarely unfolds as intended. The V-2 was meant to force submission through fear. Instead, it forced recognition that technological power could no longer be confined to the battlefield. The same ingenuity that built weapons could build pathways to the stars. The question was no longer what technology could do, but how it would be used, and by whom. In the end, the V-2 did not change the war that created it. It changed the world that came after. Its legacy was not victory or defeat, but transformation. What began as a desperate gamble became a bridge between eras, between industrial war and the age of rockets, between destruction and discovery. And as the world stepped into that new age, it carried with it a quiet lesson written in steel and fire, that the future is often born from failure, and that the most powerful inventions rarely fulfill the purpose for which they were first imagined. The consequences of the V-2 program were felt long before the war ended. From its earliest deployments, the rocket demanded more than Germany could reasonably afford. Each missile required specialized fuel, rare metals, precision engineering, and a vast supporting network of transport and labor. At a time when Germany's economy was already strained by bombing, shortages, and territorial loss, the V-2 represented an expense without return. It consumed strength faster than it generated results. This burden grew heavier as conditions worsened. Production facilities were forced underground, increasing complexity and cost. Supply chains became fragile, vulnerable to disruption at every stage. Skilled technicians were pulled from aircraft production and air defense areas where Germany still fought for survival. The V-2 program did not merely draw resources, it concentrated them into a single, inflexible effort that could not adapt to the shifting realities of the war. The irony lay in what was sacrificed. Fighter aircraft that might have defended German cities went unbuilt. Fuel that could have supported ground operations was burned in test launches. Rail capacity that might have supplied the front carried rocket components instead. The V-2 was never an addition to Germany's war effort, it was a substitution. And it replaced systems that addressed immediate threats with a weapon aimed at distant hope. As the war progressed, the imbalance became increasingly stark. Germany faced collapsing fronts, shrinking manpower, and total Allied air superiority. These were problems of scale and coordination. The V-2 addressed none of them. Its effects were localized and temporary. Its cost was constant and cumulative. With each launch, the gap between investment and outcome widened, draining a war economy that no longer had reserves to spare. The human cost deepened the tragedy. Tens of thousands of forced laborers worked under brutal conditions to sustain the program. Many did not survive. Their suffering built a weapon that could not save the state it served. This was perhaps the clearest measure of the program's futility. Extraordinary human and material sacrifice poured into an effort that offered no path to victory, only continuation of struggle. Strategically, the V-2's impact remained symbolic. It demonstrated technological prowess and instilled fear, but it did not shape decisions or outcomes. The Allies did not divert major forces from the front. Negotiations were never considered. The war followed its existing trajectory, indifferent to the rockets falling behind the lines. The V-2 became a statement rather than a strategy proof that Germany could still strike, even as it lost the ability to win. The revelation, when fully confronted, was sobering. The V-2 did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was asked to solve problems it could not address. Germany's defeat stemmed from overextension, industrial imbalance, and loss of air control. No single weapon, however advanced, could reverse these forces. By focusing so intently on the rocket, German leadership avoided confronting the deeper failures of its war effort. In this sense, the cost of the V-2 program was not only material, it was intellectual and strategic. It represented a narrowing of vision, a retreat into technological optimism at the expense of systemic thinking. The weapon became a refuge from reality, a way to believe that innovation alone could overcome circumstance. By the war's end, the ledger was clear. The V-2 had consumed enormous resources, claimed countless lives in its construction and use, and altered nothing essential about the conflict's outcome. Its value lay not in what it achieved during the war, but in what it revealed about the dangers of misplaced priorities. And as the ruins of the Reich were examined, the lesson lingered quietly among the wreckage, that the most expensive weapons are not always those built of steel and fuel, but those that divert a nation from confronting the truths it can no longer afford to ignore. For those who built and launched the V-2, the end of the war brought reflection rather than triumph. Engineers who had devoted years to solving unprecedented technical problems now confronted the gap between possibility and outcome. They had achieved what many believed impossible: controlled flight beyond the atmosphere, propulsion at supersonic speed, guidance through near space. And yet as Germany collapsed around them, the question lingered quietly: to what end had all of this been done? Among soldiers tasked with operating the weapon, the sense of futility was equally pronounced. Launch crews worked with precision and discipline, often under bombardment, aware that each successful firing demanded immense effort. They knew the missile would reach its target. They also knew it would not stop the enemy drawing closer each day. The weapon performed exactly as designed. The war did not respond in kind. This was the V-2's central irony. It held within it the potential to redefine warfare. Yet it was employed at a moment when Germany no longer possessed the strategic freedom to exploit that potential. Timing had stripped the weapon of context. What might have been decisive under different circumstances was reduced to spectacle. The rocket announced the future, but arrived trapped in the past. As defeat became unavoidable, the V-2 was increasingly viewed not as a solution, but as a symbol. It symbolized faith in technology over strategy, hope over assessment. The rocket stood for the belief that innovation alone could compensate for lost air superiority, exhausted manpower, and industrial imbalance. That belief proved false. War, at its scale, resisted shortcuts. The human cost sharpened this realization. Tens of thousands had labored under brutal conditions to sustain the program. Their suffering did not translate into advantage or survival. For many involved, this knowledge weighed heavily after the war. The brilliance of the engineering could not erase the fact that it had been harnessed to a cause already beyond rescue. Achievement and tragedy existed side by side, inseparable. The revelation that followed was not technical, but philosophical. The V-2 failed not because it was flawed, but because it was misused. It was expected to solve problems that no single weapon could address. Industrial warfare demanded systems, coordination, and time. The rocket offered none of these. It could strike, but it could not sustain. It could frighten, but it could not decide. In this sense, the V-2 became a lesson written in steel and fire. It demonstrated the danger of over-reliance on singular solutions in complex conflicts. Innovation, when isolated from strategy and reality, can accelerate failure rather than prevent it. Germany's fixation on the V-2 narrowed its options at the very moment when adaptability was most needed. After the war, as former engineers spoke openly, many acknowledged this truth. They recognized the technical achievement, but also the blindness that surrounded its use. The weapon had promised control over distance and time. Instead, it revealed how little control remained. The future it hinted at would belong to others, under very different conditions. The futility of the V-2 lay not in its design, but in its purpose. It was a solution searching for a war that no longer existed. Its legacy endured, but its mission failed completely. What it left behind was not victory, but warning. And as the world moved forward into the age of rockets and spaceflight, that warning remained quietly embedded in every launch, that no invention, however advanced, can substitute for strategy, judgment, and the willingness to confront reality before it is too late. By the war's end, the meaning of the V-2 had become unmistakable. It was a weapon of terror designed to frighten, to unsettle, to impose psychological weight where military leverage was no longer possible. It succeeded in creating fear. Cities burned without warning. Civilians died without defense. Yet fear, stripped of strategy, proved incapable of deciding anything. The V-2 revealed a hard truth that Germany learned too late. Terror does not win wars. The rocket's technological brilliance was never in doubt. It achieved what no other weapon of its time could: supersonic flight, ballistic trajectory, and the first human-made object to reach the edge of space. Engineers solved problems that would shape the next century. But technology does not exist in isolation. It requires context, timing, and integration. Germany possessed none of these when the V-2 was finally deployed at scale. The deeper failure lay not in engineering, but in strategy. Germany's war effort was undermined by overextension, loss of air superiority, industrial imbalance, and the combined weight of multiple enemies. These were systemic problems. They demanded coordination, sustainability, and adaptation. The V-2 offered spectacle instead. It struck behind the lines while the front collapsed. It consumed resources while supply chains broke. It promised reversal where only management of defeat remained possible. There was also a moral blindness embedded in the program. The suffering required to build the V-2, forced labor, brutal conditions, lives spent in underground factories, was justified by the belief that the weapon would be decisive. When it was not, that suffering stood exposed, stripped of even the illusion of necessity. The weapon did not shorten the war. It prolonged destruction without altering outcome. Germany's leadership mistook innovation for absolution. They believed a single, extraordinary invention could compensate for years of strategic error. The V-2 became a refuge from reality, a way to believe that science could override circumstance. But war, especially industrial war, does not reward brilliance alone. It rewards systems, logistics, alliances, and time. Germany had exhausted all four. In the end, the V-2 arrived too late, cost too much, and addressed the wrong problem. It could frighten populations, but not control territory. It could destroy buildings, but not halt armies. It could announce the future, but not survive the present. Its legacy was immense, but its purpose failed completely. The moral closure is clear. The V-2 stands as a warning against the temptation to seek salvation in terror and technology when judgment has already failed. It reminds us that weapons do not exist to prove ingenuity, they exist to serve strategy. When that relationship is broken, even the most advanced invention becomes hollow. Germany did not lose the war because the V-2 failed. The V-2 failed because Germany had already lost the war. That mattered the war of decisions, priorities, and realism. What remained was noise in the sky and fire on the ground, detached from consequence. And so, the final judgment endures. Quiet but unyielding. A rocket that struck fear into cities, but never changed the course of the war.